All right, in this video, we're going to talk about how we can grow this aggregate production function through increases in the inputs, but mainly through increases in technology. To increase output, it can occur a number of ways. One, we can, output can increase through accumulating capital. That's done by increasing investment and buying capital goods, which are then used for production. Right? Investment in capital is going to lead to increases in production because workers are going to become relatively more productive if they have more capital available to them. Right? Additionally, you can increase output through increases in labor. Okay? And this can be done either by increasing the human capital or just increasing the number of people working or the number of hours that they work. Okay? Lastly, output can be increased by improvements in technology. Okay? And this is the big one. This is the big one. Why? Because you can only accumulate so much capital. There's fixed resources in the world. There's only so much capital available. Same with labor. There's only a certain number of people that can work in an economy. There's only a certain number of hours in a day in which workers can work. There's a constraint, an upper bound constraint at which we can accumulate enough labor and capital. However, there isn't an upper bound constraint on the ways we can combine that labor and capital to produce output. Okay? And that combination of labor and capital and the process of combining labor and capital to produce output, that's technology. And so there's an infinite number of ways we can process our inputs. And because of that, that is how we can sustain long-run growth, is through these advancements in technology, in how we combine our inputs to produce output. So because of the diminishing returns in capital and labor, increases to these inputs aren't the sole source of long-run economic growth. Okay? Somehow we have to become more efficient. We have to increase productivity. Increase in efficiency means productivity increases. Okay? And so when we become more efficient at turning our inputs into output, we become, those inputs essentially become more productive at converting inputs to output, which means graphically our aggregate production function will shift up. Why? Because we can produce more output with the same amount of capital and labor. All right, so let's take a look at what happens when there is an increase in technology. Well, notice that the aggregate production function has shifted up. It's kind of tilted up, but it's shifted up. It's, here we have an economy with higher levels of technology. So let's say this is like technology level is at, let's say, like 1.5, where here technology level, the index is something going to be like 1 point, let's call it 1. So we have better technology represented by a higher value or higher index for this term A. And where we have worse technology, wherein the A index is something like less than 1.5, we call it 1.1. Notice that we have capital on the x-axis, which means labor is being held constant. So if we let's just find a value of capital. Let's just say capital is, let's say we just have, I don't know, $100 100,000 units of capital. Well, notice, remember, labor's being held constant. Well, if we look at our output, this is the same amount of capital and labor. Capital is equal to 100. Labor, let's say labor is constant at, let's say, 100 million hours worked. Well, we have 100 units of capital of 100 million hours of labor. The only thing that's changed is technology. Technology has become more efficient. So in that case, real GDP is going to be greater, but we're still using the same number of inputs. The importance of this is that we don't have to use additional resources to produce more stuff. Rather, we've just gotten better at combining those resources to be able to produce some output. So this is where long-run sustained economic growth comes from, is through these increases in technology and the associated increases in productivity in the labor and capital inputs. Okay, so what happens when technology increases, and we'll talk about this a little bit more next week, and when we talk about short-run fluctuations in the final section. But when technology increases, what that means is that the marginal products, the additional output from one more unit increase in capital and labor, well, they're going to get bigger. If you have with higher technology, a 1 unit increase in labor, a 1 unit increase in capital is now going to result in a larger increase in output. Okay, it means, so marginal product of capital, marginal product of labor, these are like the benefit, the marginal benefit. It's measured in output of 1 more unit of labor in the marginal product of labor case and capital in the marginal product of capital case. Okay, and so that's what we're saying, is that when technology increases, it increases the marginal benefit of these inputs, which, if marginal benefit of something goes up, marginal cost presumably stays the same. So we'll say that the cost of capital and labor stays relatively the same. Well, if the marginal benefit goes up, that creates an incentive to invest more in labor and capital. Marginal benefit of something goes up, marginal cost stays the same, you do more of the activity. Well, the activity, right, in this case, is hiring workers and investing in capital. So because the marginal benefit is increased because of the technological increase, creates more of an incentive to invest in capital and in labor, which promotes even further economic growth. Okay, so the effect of technology on inputs is really important because it drives up the marginal benefit of inputs, which is going to create more investment into the economy, into the inputs of the economy. Okay, and so when we look at a breakdown of where our real growth, our real GDP growth has come from over the past 70 years, well, we see that a lot of the growth comes from technology improvements, from just getting better at turning our inputs into output. Right? So we see that technology accounts for, what is it, about 2/3, I'd argue about 2/3 of real GDP growth, maybe a fifth to 1/3 to 2/3 of real GDP growth, where increases in productivity through physical and human capital, through labor and capital, they stay in aggregate. They stay pretty constant. They're anywhere between growth rates of about 1 to 1.2. I guess it's 0.9. I should say 0.9 to about 1.2 over the last 6 decades. So you see that a larger proportion is coming from of productivity growth is coming from technology, but there's also these increases in human capital and in physical capital that have led to increases in productivity. Okay? If we compare our productivity increases across countries, well, we see that the U.S., again, why is it seen so much economic growth? Well, because of the increases in productivity. Now, if we come over here, or sorry, yeah, the higher levels of productivity, I should say. Well, if we look at, what what productivity would be if other countries are at the same level as the U.S. in terms of technology, well, we see that other countries would have significantly increased their productivity with higher levels of technology. Okay? Now, notice that the U.S. also has higher levels of schooling and of capital stock, which is also driving up their productivity. But with the increased levels of technology, we'll see that the gap between productivity in other countries with lower levels of technology shrinks when they have the same amount of technology as like the average U.S. worker. Right? So the point being, technology really is important in driving economic growth, and it is the main driver of economic growth. Not just because it contemporaneously increases real GDP, but also because it will lead to future increases in real GDP through those technological advancements. So big takeaway, how do you create economic growth? Through technological advancements, and then the resulting effect they're going to have on the input. So that's all for this week, this video. Next week, we're going to associate what we learned this week with the aggregate production function and the inputs of labor and capital. And then we're going to expand upon the labor input to talk about the labor market and show how that's related to overall production in the economy. Okay? All right. Have a good week, and I will talk to you soon.